Thank you so much for being here. And I'm actually really excited to be introducing Paul Dolan. In 2006, I was in the agribusiness department, and we made a trip to Fetzer Vineyards, and we got to see and learn about all the amazing, innovative things Paul Dolan had done there at Fetzer and is continuing. He's now the owner of Dolan Family Ranch, and he has just recently published a book called True to Our Roots, which I absolutely love. I love the title of this book, Being from Wine and Viticulture, True to Our Roots, Fermenting a Business Revolution. He's extremely innovative, and what Paul Dolan has taught us, it's extremely important, as someone mentioned earlier, to break down the silos and to look at every part of what you're doing. It's not just what's in the field. It's not just what's fermenting in the tank. It's actually looking at how they work together and how it affects the business, our resources, and therefore how sustainable is your business for our planet, for our world. And I find that extremely inspiring. And what I love about it is over there you see our Cal Poly Wine. Cal Poly Wine and Vit is a brand new department. We were formed in 2013, and I want to say it was sort of in the image and likeness, oh my God, that was sort of weird, but anyway, of what Paul Dolan did at Fetzer. We broke down the barriers. We're a department where our students learn they have to pay attention to everything. They have to look at what it takes to grow a grape, what it takes to make wine, and what it takes to run the business in wine. And look at your resources that you're using. We are also in the process of building our Center for Wine and Viticulture and raising money for it, and with the goal of having a sustainable future and wonderful facility for our students that are amazing quality students to have the amazing facilities that they deserve. Now, Paul, I think I've said enough about you. Everyone wants to hear from you, so please come up, and it's great to meet you. Were you there in 2006 when the agribusiness department came? Yeah, I think. Did you have a female viticulture that was at Cal Poly grad? Where is she? Because I know we were shown around, but I know it was a female who was running the vineyard, which I absolutely love. You know, I'm a woman too. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. So that was Ann Thrupp probably that hosted you all when you came up. Ann ran the sustainability program for Fetzer and did a wonderful job. And we're fortunate she's actually here today. So this is really great. I love the fact that Hunter put this presentation together with this forum together, because I think that this is a really critical conversation. I have to admit I have an agenda. That is that I have something to say here, and it's in complete alignment and support of what this conference is all about. So we're going to talk about resilience, but I'm going to talk about it from a particular angle called regenerative. It's a new framework for me. You mentioned that I had written this book about sustainable business and sustainable business practices. I'm sort of reinventing myself, and I've become much more engaged and much more involved in the area of agriculture, and particularly in this conceptual framework, which I'll talk about today, called regenerative. Now, before I get started, I want to make a couple comments about my family. I'm really proud of the fact that I'm a fourth-generation winemaker, and I've been in the business for a long time, but I'm much more proud of the fact that my sons are now fifth-generation wine growers, and I get the chance to work with them on a daily basis, whether it's in a winery or in the vineyards themselves, but I primarily spend time in the vineyards. So my oldest son studied business, got a business degree, and he's our viticulturalist. My other son studied viticulture, and of course, he's our businessman in our family. But I also have a daughter who's quite a bit younger. Her name is Sasakaya. don't know if anybody have ever heard the name Sassicaia, but she's named after a little winery in Tuscany, in the little village of Bulgari. And when Sassicaia was born, she came a little early. She came about 3 weeks early. So I called up one of my sons and I said, you got to run down and get a bottle of Sassicaia. He arrived at the hospital about 5 minutes after Sassicaia did. And I opened the bottle, poured a little glass of wine, put my finger in it, put a little drop on her tongue. And I would do that every night. And I would tell her the story of that wine and the background of that wine. And I can tell you, by the time she was 3 years old, she could blind taste wines with some of the best winemakers in California. Now, I don't tell that story to everybody, but since you guys are sort of an ag school and you kind of can appreciate that, I tell you that story because I just want you to have some sort of sense of sort of my relationship with my kids. I could get a little emotional here, but I am very concerned about what's happening on the planet today. You know, particularly when you consider that on a daily basis, every day we use more natural capital from this planet than the planet is able to produce. So if you just extrapolate that out, one would say that we're in trouble, particularly when the population's only 7 billion people at the current time. So we're going to put a huge strain on this. So I want you to know that I am committed to creating a shift in sustainability of the planet through leadership in agriculture. And my particular initiative is in this area of regenerative ag. I am committed to creating a new awareness of a new contextual framework, not the framework that we're operating from today, which is extractive in its nature, but much more in the form of a regenerative approach to farming. So what I'm going to do today, or this morning, is share some what I describe as conceptual frameworks that will start to bring that concept to life, and I like to believe that it's something that we could share with others. So what I want to do is I want to start with some history. I want to start with the history of agriculture. We're going to go back 12,000 years, and I promise it'll be a short history. So agriculture started about 12,000 years ago. It started right after the Ice Age. And at that time, we were hunter-gatherers, and we lived in tribes. And the contextual framework around agriculture at that time was survival. Can we get enough food? And we worked in tribes in order to be able to obtain enough food to survive. And as time sort of marched on, we started to discover what was described as wild agriculture. We started to find wild plants that we could start to work around and start to develop in some sort of domesticated fashion. So we started to domesticate animals, we started to domesticate plants. Apparently wheat was one of the first plants that we were able to convert over and start to be able to manage to some degree, and then grains, and then things like figs. And this was happening all over the planet. It was happening in Europe, it was happening in Asia, it was happening in India, it was happening in Africa. So there was sort of these pockets of technology, if you will. Now this is thousands of years ago right now, so I don't want you to think that I've fast-forwarded really quickly at this stage of the game. So it was a very, very long, slow process. But during that time frame, there was different changes in context. One was survival. Eventually it became about community. We started moving from tribes to villages to communities to fast forward today to nations. As we continued to explore, we started to see a new opportunity. That was in the area of trade. And so there started to become communication between different continents, if you will. We started to move technology from one to another. And then if you move even further, fast forward again, we look into the time frame around the Renaissance period, maybe 300-400 years ago. There was some sort of significant discoveries. During that period of time, we were gathering information from art and philosophy and science and religion and nature and literature. All of those things kind of came to play. But it was also at that time frame is when we started to really become focused on science. That's the area of Newton was during that time frame, and he discovered, as amongst many other things, gravity and that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So our energy as a society became really organized around this, around science, but also around this discovery of how things worked. And we started to move into what I'm going to call sort of a reductive phase. We started to break things down into little individual units, And today, I'm going to pull my iPhone out, that it's given us the opportunity to be able to create this. It also, if we fast forward, it gave us the opportunity to create synthetic fertilizers. So ammonium nitrate came on the scene about 1920, 1910, 1920. That completely transformed agriculture. So we went from scarcity, food scarcity, we went to a contextual framework of building community, we went to another contextual framework of a trade, and now we are in what one would describe as industrial ag. It came out of the Industrial Revolution, and there was a particular orientation we had to growth and development that came from that engine that was created in the 1700s and the fuel, and agriculture aligned itself with that Industrial Revolution, which is amazing. It created all of that we have here today, the wonderful life we have, the ability to feed 7 billion people on the planet. That said, there are some things that are changing. The climate is changing, both literally and actually. And we're starting to see that agriculture is experiencing some challenges, maybe one would say, and maybe some change of perception. One of them is pollution. We clearly know that we're using a lot more chemicals than we ever used before. Today we're using somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 billion pounds of chemicals on a daily basis, or an annual basis, throughout the planet. And the US uses about 25% of that. We're also seeing that we have a huge problem and challenge with erosion. They say that we're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 7% on an annual basis of our topsoil, which is really hard to imagine. You project that out, that's a pretty scary number. They say that we've lost, and my numbers are from the Millennium Report, the UN Millennium Report. We've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of all of our topsoil to date. So that combination of those two is actually creating some amazing loads into the system. And it's showing up as what we call dead zones. So in the 1950s, there was about 20 dead zones in the US. These are nutrient overloads in confined areas or in specific areas. The mouth of the Mississippi is a great example. It represents sort of thousands of miles of biologically dead areas at the mouth of the Mississippi and the Gulf. So in the 1950s, there was 20 of them. Today, fast forwarding, there's over 400 of these around the world. We're also seeing that there's a significant impact on our ecosystems. If we look at water, we know that there's challenges here in this community. We know that there's challenges in California. But we're seeing that it's the challenge all over the world. We look at the Yellow River, for instance, in China. They say that it's 50% of that river. That's over a 3,000-mile long river. 50% of that river is biologically dead, if you can imagine. The Yangtze is the same. The Abu Daru, the Ganges in India, similar dynamics. Our own Colorado is significantly stressed. Not to the situation of biological life, but really more from the standpoint that by the time it reaches its mouth, it's a trickle. The demand for water is huge, and the demand for water has just been exacerbated by the drought, but in reality, we're drawing more water than we actually are able to replenish naturally. The Ogallala aquifer that goes from the Dakotas down to Colorado over to Texas is absolutely huge. Apparently we're drawing it 3 times faster than it's actually able to replenish itself. So these are some really, really scary numbers. Back to the land, it's been reported that we are losing somewhere in the neighborhood due to erosion about 25 million acres annually. And that's really a hard number to even imagine. And when it comes to air quality, from a natural resource standpoint, we know that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is higher than it's been in the last 800,000 years. It's never been above 280 parts per million, and now it's right in the range of 400 parts per million. All of these are definitely having a negative impact and an impact on how we view agriculture. The other one is that if we look at the species that we're now operating from, whether it's plants or animals, There's been such a huge reduction. We've gone from thousands of species of corn and wheat, and you can look at all of the program crops or even some of the smaller crop areas. They've all been drastically diminished, primarily because of industrial ag. We found that there are certain varieties that are more conducive to growing in larger situations, but we've diminished the amount of species, which actually has had a big impact on species in general. It's been predicted that between the year 2000 and the year 2050, we're going to lose 50% of the species on the planet. Now, that's more than the tigers and the elephants, which are very upsetting, but it really has a lot more to do with small birds and insects that really are what give, that diversity is what really gives the life energy and the health to the planet. Now, there's another kind of significant piece, and the dean pointed it out. When Michael Pollan came down here, it was standing room only. There is a huge awareness in the public, and they have a particular concern and they have a particular interest, and that's the health of themselves and their families and in their communities. And we are becoming a very educated society, and we're now creating different expectations of retailers, which are creating different expectations for farmers. And for those in the room, as farmers, we know that. We know that there's the shifting tide. So all of this is a bit scary and a bit disconcerting, and farmers are reacting to it. And we're starting to see a shift in tide. I think there's going to be a conversation about, and Mark's going to talk about animal grazing and intensive grazing and the work that's happening there. We're going to have a conversation about organic food, because these are some of the new expectations that we as consumers are having. So I'd like to suggest that there's a new way and a new context that we could actually hold agriculture in. And I call it regenerative. And actually, I've written out this because I think when one starts to create new frameworks or new conceptual frameworks, one has to be pretty diligent about the nature of the language that one uses. So we've just, if you will, we're in a discussion as a society around sustainability. And there was a language that was created around sustainability. You mentioned the book that I wrote was about sustainable business practices. And, but I think we've seen agriculture set the stage for societal development, if you will. It was agriculture that gave us our modern day society. And I believe that it's agriculture that's going to create the difference for us going forward. I just want to suggest that I don't think that the current system is sufficient enough to be able to overcome the hurdles that we have facing us today. So there's my definition for regenerative ag. Regenerative agriculture is any kind of farming system that regenerates and revitalizes the restorative capacity of the soil and its surroundings, thereby enhancing the farm's natural system. Regenerative agriculture practices build the farm's resilience so as to recover from and cope with adversity, such as drought, disease, pests, insects, fungus, mold, and weather changes. And regenerative agriculture creates an abundance of food and other agricultural products, contributes to the vibrancy of communities, and respects the ecology of the natural world. So for me, I think that there's a shift that we need to make, and that's a shift from short-term thinking to long-term investment in agriculture and on the farm. I think there's a shift from the extractive method of agriculture to one of building resilience and vitality into the space in which we actually farm. I believe that there's an opportunity to create a shift from monocultures to polyculture, and I believe that there's a shift possible from a reductive approach to a whole systems approach. So what I would like to do is now is just kind of give you a vision of what I see as some of the conceptual frameworks that will sort of bring to life this idea of a whole systems approach. I didn't put any slides up here. I'm not a techie guy, so. I don't see the power slide buttons. That's my farm back home. So, my first conceptual framework is our farm is part of a larger system. My first aha as a winemaker came several years ago during harvest. And I can remember being out in one particular vineyard, tasting the fruit, trying to determine whether the grapes were ready to harvest. And I was in a Sauvignon Blanc vineyard. I tasted the fruit off of one vine, had all of the fruit and melon and fig characteristics I'd expect for Sauvignon Blanc. And then I walked just 10 feet over to the next row and another vine and tasted the fruit that was flat and insipid. I didn't get it. I didn't understand why that was. And I would have great hopes for that wine, but each year I'd end up being disappointed. Those grapes ended up going into our everyday table wine. But 3 years after I converted that particular vineyard to organic, those same grapes started to go into our top-level Sauvignon Blanc. So I realized a couple things. One was that I took the chemicals out, if you will. I could make better wine. And the other one is I realized that that the chemicals I was using, the herbicides, the pesticides, the synthetic fertilizers I was using were killing the microbial life in the soil. And it was damaging that environment, and it was damaging the ability of that farm and that vine to be able to express itself. So I realized that my farm and my business was part of a larger system. I wasn't isolated. I wasn't alone. I wasn't separate. And those things that I did actually had an impact downstream, possibly on other farms, and at that time was actually probably buying grapes from some of those other farms. Now, I also want to say that as I'm starting to realize I forgot to mention something in the history of farming, is that when farmers farmed during that period of time, they were really very connected to their surroundings. They actually were in tune with the rhythms and the energies that existed in their surroundings. There's a great word. It's an indigenous word in Central America called Pachamama. Anybody familiar with Pachamama? Ah, good. You know the organization Pachamama, probably. So the indigenous people would describe Pachamama as earth, all time, and all universe. So they see themselves connected in that way. They see themselves connected to the past. So as farming occurred over thousands of years, farmers, one, were connected with what was happening in the cosmos around them, and they were paid attention to the things that they did and the timing in which they did them and the results that occurred. And then they passed that on from generation to generation. And that was alive and well probably until the mid-1800s, when 90% of the 90% of the population in the United States was still farming. But moving forward into 1910, 1920, it was down to 30%, and today it's 2%. So there's been a huge, huge shift and a huge loss of understanding and appreciation. So I find myself these days wanting to better understand what the sensibility of the plant is on this farm and inside of this larger system. So this is going to be a group participation, and you guys in the front, a lot of you are professors, so you should have all of the answers here, right? So what I want to do is I want to look at what is it. So I'm going to suggest that the plant is impacted in two ways. Now I'm going to say the plant, but it could be my grapevine, it could be a tomato vine, and it could be a cow. We have emancipated ourselves from our environment, right? Pretty clear. We're inside. All of the plants and animals, they're all outside. So they have a different relationship with their surroundings. And they have a different way of expressing what's occurring throughout the day and throughout the seasons. So what's the single biggest rhythm and or force, energy force, that impacts our plants? Speak up. Light. Light, heat, the sun. That's right. It provides a certain amount of energy, which then the plant converts into a different energy, and then we can utilize that energy. Either we or animals or other plants can actually utilize that energy through photosynthesis, right? So what's another energy that it comes from the cosmos? Well, everything this is above the earth now. What's another one? Water. Water. Sure, we get rain. And there's also humidity. There's a certain amount of humidity that is always present, unless maybe you live in the Sahara, I suppose. But there's a cloak around the earth itself. It's always providing some sort of moisture. What else? What other force that would impact the plant? Air, right. Wind. What else? Say again? CO2, huge, and even more so. And actually, the plants are benefiting from it at this stage of the game because they've got a lot of food. CO2 is a critical element in the development of plants. Of course, plants absorb CO2 and release oxygen. So what else do you see up there in the sky? Moon, absolutely. We're familiar with the influences of the moon. When it moves to the full moon, there's a lifting action, and when it moves to the new moon, there's a sort of a suppression. Yet there's actually 6 phases to the moon. We're all pretty familiar with one. I'm not going to go through all 6, but there's 6 phases to the moon. And the plant has that sensitivity to the moon. There's radiation in the atmosphere. There is magnetism in the atmosphere. There is electricity in the air. There is energy that comes from other plants. There is energy that comes from other animals, whether domestic or they're wild. The plant is completely surrounded by these energies. Now, what about beneath the soil? There's a bunch of tips up there on that picture. What happens? What impacts the plant beneath the soil? Microbes, lots and lots of microbes. There's fungi, there's nematodes, there's a whole world beneath the soil. And I love the fact that you're having a conference on soil. I think that's really great. I think I might actually drive all the way down here again to go to that. We have a molten core in the earth. We have gases that rise up. There's a levitational effect. Oh, I forgot. Of course, we have gravity that has a huge impact on a plant, right? And then there's levity. As heat rises, so does the plant. The plant's always lifting. It's always reaching for the sun. So I bring these things up because what I've become acutely aware of is that the plant really is in balance with 2 different polarities. That of the earth, which we often think of, that's where plant gets all of its energy. We sort of, that's how we think of it. We water the plants. That's what we do. We water and fertilize. End of story. But the reality is the development of the plant in its growth pattern and its development of its leaves each year, they may be have a particular archetype, but the plant leaves are going to be different. They're going to have a different shape. The canes are going to have a different length. The shoots are going to have a different length. Each and every year, it's different based on a certain set of circumstances, but it's all of that. It's the entire system. And I feel as a farmer, it's important for me to understand that. The second conceptual framework is it's about the space. It's about the health of the space, not the health of the plant, or not the health of the animal. If we can bring health into the environment, the plant will do well. And I like to use the metaphor, I'm an organic and a biodynamic farmer, so I'm going to use that framework if it's okay. I'm also a conventional farmer as well. I have one vineyard that's conventional, one that's organic, one that's biodynamic. And I like to use this framework of raising I'm going to say an organic vine is like raising a child. All we can really do as parents is contribute to the health of the space in which our kids grow. We can feed them well, ideally organic. We can give them the opportunity to go to good schools, to live in good neighborhoods, to have good friends, to be involved in whatever activities they like, whether it's science or sports or art. And our greatest hope is that when they grow up, they'll be fully expressed. It's the same thing for our grapevines. If we bring health and vitality into the space, we're going to create an environment for the plant to thrive, to send its roots down deep, to be able to grab the expression of that place and demonstrate it. I'm going to talk about two aspects, that of diversity of plant forms, or diversity of activity in which we grow the plant, and its contribution to the self-regulating system. Because essentially, that's what we really want to do in building this healthy environment in this healthy space. So first of all, I want to talk about beneath the soil. So actually, I could probably go to the next slide. So beneath the soil, what we do on our farm is we use a combination of three things. One is we build compost piles. The compost piles that we make for our ranches probably wouldn't fit inside of this room. That's how big they are. So we use pumice, which is the skins and seeds from the grapes. We mix in organic manure from an organic dairy, and we mix in straw. And we compost throughout the year. Then we spread it on the soil. Then we follow that with seeding our cover crops, and we grow our cover crops. And there was probably a picture on the other slide that showed the cover crops that usually are legumes that extract nitrogen from the air. But our conceptual framework here is that we are feeding the soil. We are not feeding plants. And we're feeding the entire microbial base beneath the soil. We're feeding the fungi. We recognize that the diversity of microbial activity in the soil is what brings health and vitality and resilience to the plant. In the wine industry, we had this, we were plagued with this thing called phylloxera. It was a root louse, and it had been around for a couple hundred years. It basically devastated the European grape industry back in the 1800s, and then it came back to California. It started in California, came back to California, and we found that in the 1990s, we lost about half of the North Coast and the Central Coast grapevines because of this root louse. Because one of the roots that we were planted on was not resistant. My neighbor across the street has a vineyard that actually I managed for a number of years that is now 35 years old, and it is on that non-resistant rootstock. And it's been farmed organically all that period of time, and this vineyard is in full production still today at 35 years old, which is almost twice as long as the average vineyard survives in Napa and Sonoma today. So there's something that's going on in that soil as a result of that practice of constantly feeding the soil. And we know that we don't know exactly, because the soil is a really very complicated system, but there is a bacterial pathogen that is in higher quantities in organic soil than there is in conventional soil. And we believe that that's probably what's suppressing the phylloxera. It's still there. Now, when we go above the soil, we use some of the same practices, that same kind of diversity, to build up this sort of resilient system, this self-regulating system. We use cover crops, which provide a nectar, which attract a wide variety of both predator and problem insects. We also plant what we call insectary areas, but actually I call them bug farms, which are large areas within the farm, or we have a bug highway that's about 2,000 feet long. It's plants that actually will attract beneficials, whether they are pollinators, natural pollinators, or birds. We have a number of bird boxes and bees and butterflies and on and on and on and on. The idea is to create as much diversity as we possibly can so that we don't have to use the pesticides. We're fortunate, for the last 6 years, we have not used a pesticide, which is unheard of, just unheard of. It just doesn't happen that way in our industry. The last conceptual framework is to look at the farm like it's a living organism. Perfect. 5 minutes I got. Like it's a living organism. So I believe that the farm actually has an individuality. It has something it wants to express. It has a personality. Some even say that it has an ego. It has something that wants to show up. And the good news is, we as farmers get to decide what that is. But we don't exactly, we do decide, in the end we decide. But the opportunity we have as farmers is to listen for the farm. Listen for what it is that the farm wants to express. Listen for what the farm isn't saying that if we supported it, it could say. I look at the farm like it has a circulatory system. So it has a pattern and it has a flow. There's about a 700 or 800 foot elevation difference here. I notice how the water flows down through the soil and how far it goes and how much water can actually be absorbed by the soil. And notice how it flows down through the little tributaries and works its way down to the pond. So this is the life of the farm, knowing where and how the circulatory system works on your farm. The farm has a respiratory system. It has a pattern of wind. In our case, it comes up around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But we also know that the farm breathes in at night and breathes out every morning. It breathes out monthly as to the moon cycles. So it's breathing out as it's moving into the full moon and in as it's moving into the new moon. And it breathes on an annual basis throughout the seasons. This is all information that we can use as to when we're going to do different practices, when we're going to fertilize, when we're going to irrigate, because we want those things to have a particular movement throughout the farm. The farm also has a digestive system, and the digestive system is the microbial activity that we have, but it is also the animals. In our particular case, we move the animals in and out throughout the farm. They take the grass, they convert it into manure, which is a whole different natural method for fertilizing our vineyards. So, and it has a nervous system, and the nervous system is the farmer. So the good news is that we do have a place inside of this whole system. So in summary, what I want to suggest is that there have been different contextual frameworks that have occurred throughout time for the food system, for agriculture. And we're currently in a contextual framework around industrial farming. And I believe that there's a new opportunity for us to reframe agriculture going forward, because I don't think that the current system is sufficient. And we can describe this as regenerative, a system that revitalizes, enhances the life forces that exist in the farm, such that those same life forces can find their way into our food. Thank you very much.